Okay, everyone, we're going to start the plenary session now. We're delighted to have Professor Karthik Muralidharan with us today. So, Karthik Muralidharan is the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. His research spans public finance and development economics with a focus on improving education, health, welfare, and public service delivery. His work has been published in several world-leading and academic journals, including the American Economic Review, Quarterly Journal of Economics, Journal of Political Economy, and Econometrica. He has actively engaged in policy advising and capacity building in India at both the central and state government levels, and in public communication of research insights through series of podcasts, which he has agreed to do one for us today as well. Professor Muralidharan is also the co-founder and scientific director of the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States, in short known as CGIS, and which is a non-profit organization that works with state governments of India to improve state capacity, governance, and service delivery. Born and raised in Ahmedabad itself, he holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Harvard, an MPhil degree from University of Cambridge, and a PhD in economics from Harvard. Once again, we're really delighted to have him join us today. And over to you, sir.
And the clicker is here. All right, wonderful. And you can hear me clearly in the back there? All good? And the video is all fine? All right. So thanks so much. Thanks to the organizers. It's always a pleasure to be Ahmedabad, as was just mentioned. This is actually where I grew up. The first 16 years of my life was here. I'm delighted to have friends and friends from school, parents of friends, teachers in the audience. But amazingly, it's actually my first public lecture on the book. So I'll probably cover some ground that some of you have heard before, but I'll also kind of spend some time on some newer frames. So the other warning for people who haven't heard me before is I talk very fast, but but it's usually clear, but you're going to have to focus. All right. So let's get started. Okay. So So the title of the book is called Accelerating India's Development, right? And it's a state-led roadmap. So the focus really is on actions that we take at the state government level. So let's jump right in, okay? So when we take stock about India overall, okay, in the macro scene, we are in fact doing reasonably well, okay? The key question is, how can we do better? And as we saw yesterday in Professor Mahendra Dev's address, there are many, many things that we have to be proud of, okay? So in the global landscape, we are still the fastest growing large economy. The macro stability is something to be envied. We've never defaulted in our debt. We have an outstanding central bank. As you look around the world, you realize that these are not things you should take for granted, okay? That our macro fiscal management is overall quite sensible, is something that one should not kind of take for granted, okay? The size, the demographics, the democracy, the diaspora, these are all kind of, big assets, okay? But at the same time, we face profound challenges that inhibit getting to full potential, especially on basic service delivery, okay? So education, you got over 50% of kids in rural India completing primary school without being able to read second standard level, and which basically means that your long-term education and human development is essentially compromised forever, okay? Nutrition, you've got about 35% of children who are stunted. That's 2 standard deviations below the global height for age means, okay, at age 5. And so that's again going to have severe long-term limitations developmental potential. Public safety, the police are understaffed, overworked, so which is, not just something that matters in terms of general safety, but it also matters in terms of key economic factors like female labor force participation, right? Where we've got tons of studies just showing how safety is like a first order constraint. The justice system, to put it politely, is a train wreck, okay? With a backlog of over 30 million cases, to the point that investors, for the most part, seek arbitration in the country before they're even willing capital. Okay, so these are serious kind of challenges that we face. The welfare system exists, and it was nice to hear Ravi Kanpur's talk yesterday about a unified framework of thinking about welfare. But like he said, often in societies with a lot of informality, the welfare system ends up being pretty weak, if not in some cases, not even available. And then crucially, the biggest problem we face as a country is that of creating high quality jobs. Okay, so the thing is, as with everything about India, and I think Dr. Mahendra, they mentioned this yesterday, that whatever is true, the opposite is also true, because in a 1.4 billion person distribution, you can tell whatever story you want by where in the distribution you're sampling. Okay, now, but if you look at data and objective data to kind of broadly characterize the Indian economy, the simple story of the Indian economy, okay, and this is coming even from, summaries like the Indus Valley report of investors who are kind of really writing with kind of cool head about characterizing the economy from an investor perspective, okay? And broadly, what the report says is there's an India 1, okay? And India 1, which is the top 10% that has an average income of about $15,000 a year, okay? And so that's the group that is driving demand and creating kind of most of the dynamism in the economy. You have an India 2, that's the next 25%, with a GDP per capita of about $3,000, okay? And a lot of this segment is essentially in service sector jobs of various quality, supporting the demand created by the top 10%, okay? So pretty much your entire gig worker economy, all your domestic help, everybody who you see in urban India, is essentially already in India. Okay, and then you have an India 3 that's close to 1 billion people, right? Meaning that is living on a per capita income of about $1,000 a year. Okay, and that is at sub-Saharan African country levels. Okay, and that's a demographic that is largely supported by welfare programs. Okay, and so there are 2 or 3 implications here, right? So the first is, it's when you look at these numbers, this is kind of why the politics of this country is fundamentally about who can announce the bigger welfare scheme, because that's kind of where the numbers are, okay? So that's one key part. The second key part is that, when you think about things like the middle income trap, okay, that we often talk about, I think sometimes that can be quite misleading, okay? And that's because it's true that on average as a country, we have a GDP per capita of $2,800 that makes us a low middle income country, okay? But if you break it up, you've actually got 1 billion people at sub-Saharan African income levels, okay? And so when we think about what is the right strategy, it's really important to keep in mind that kind of heterogeneity in the population, right? So there's this old joke about economists that applies to statisticians as well, right? Of the economist who drowned crossing a pond that was on average 3 feet deep, right? And so the averages that way can be very, very misleading if you're not paying attention to these variations in the distribution, okay? Now, before we beat down on ourselves, I think it's important to recognize that this model has actually worked reasonably well, okay? And the good news is 10% of India is still 140 million people, okay? So that's a large enough population to drive innovation, drive GCCs, drive some of the most innovative startups. And that's kind of really the segment we see in this room. And that's what makes India a bit of an envy globally, right? Like, so our classmate from school in Ahmedabad, Akash Palkiwala, is the CFO of Qualcomm. And, they've got their biggest kind of development center in the world outside San Diego in Hyderabad and Bangalore, okay? So, and that's and they hired tens of thousands of people because you're getting top class global talent that's staffing GCCs, okay? So it's really those kind of investments in innovation kind of give the optimism and dynamism to India. And the other reason to not feel bad about this is historically, remember, inequality per se is an artifact of the growth process, okay? So when everybody is poor, you have high equality. And then when you have growth, the growth is invariably driven by people with access to physical capital, financial capital, and human capital, okay? So those are the three segments that benefit from the growth, okay? So this is what we're seeing is pretty normal, okay? And it's in many ways, and I was with a school friends reunion last night, and of course, as will happen with most upper middle class tax-paying elite conversations, are always wondering about all these freebies, okay? But the way I think about this is actually it's a testament to the positives of Indian democracy, okay? That we have a political process that gets us to broadly distribute some of the benefits of that growth, okay? So the question is not welfare. The question is, how do you redirect that political urge and impulse for a certain amount of inclusion into more productive investments so that you are able to convert kind of that bottom 65%, 70%, passive recipients of welfare to being active contributors to both personal and national progress, okay? And so the key limitation there is actually going to be the effectiveness of public delivery of essential goods and services, okay? So, and just like the Indian economy is bipolar, the Indian state is also bipolar, okay? So there are things we do incredibly well. So the Indian state in mission mode is one of the most impressive kind of administrative constructions on the planet, okay? So we run the world's most impressive vaccination campaigns, census campaigns, election campaigns. We do the logistics of the Kumbh Mela, which most countries couldn't even fathom, right? We will kind of do the world's lowest cost moon landing missions, okay? Thanks in part to our outstanding scientific talent and ISRO and affiliated agencies. So we do these mission mode things incredibly well, okay? But we fail at the routine, day-to-day, regular functioning of the state, okay? And the key reason is that when you're in mission mode, you can take your limited resources and target them on a well-defined problem in a time-bound way, okay? But when you have to do day-to-day service delivery, you can't do that like unless your overall systems are keeping pace, okay? So now, even here, we've had substantial improvements in the last decade, especially with kind of DBT and the delivery of benefits to citizens that kind of bypass intermediate layers of the state. But there's a long way to go in the human intermediated delivery of essential service. Whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's police, whether it's justice, the technology can augment the productivity of the frontline staff, but you can't jump over, okay, like the essentiality of that staff, okay? And so that's kind of where we really need to focus on if we're going to get to full potential as a country. And the key point is that almost all of these issues are at the state government level, okay? So constitutionally, 90% of the issues that affect the lives of citizens are state government issues, okay? So education, health, nutrition, police, land laws, labor laws, these are all state government issues. Okay, and still, when we talk about our policy discourse, we're still disproportionately focusing on what government of India should do, whereas states in India are bigger than most countries, and where the discourse has to move is to kind of catalyze state-level thinking and state-level action. Okay, and that's kind of what the book is trying to do by putting state-led in the title of the book itself. Okay, now, so let's take a step back and come back to kind of why should we do this, okay? So why is investing in state effectiveness? Because there's many things we can do, okay? So we can do infrastructure, we can do more budgets here. So why should this be the most important thing we need to focus on? Okay? And basically, the problem is having been not just in research, but policy, for the past 10, 15 years, in almost every policy discussion you are in, the default approach to improving public services is to advocate for more spending, okay? So education wallas want 6% of GDP, health wallas want 3% of GDP, the security guys want more money, the army needs more money, everybody wants more money, okay? But there's two fundamental, and higher education wants more money, okay? I was, and it's true, like, I've been visiting a whole bunch of public universities in the past year and a half, and there's no question, right? Like, I mean, that they need investment, right? So everybody wants money, but there are two challenges. The first is we don't have the money, okay? And that, so, you can ask for the money all you want, right? But all of these ideas of spending 6% of GDP on education come from high-income OECD norms that have a tax to GDP ratio of 35%. We are at a tax to GDP ratio of half of that, okay? We are at 18%, which means that you can't just say if magically I had the money, things would work well. Okay. So first, it's not an option. The second, and in some ways more important, is that a key finding from empirical research in the social sector of the past 20 years is that the translation of your typical government is incredibly poor. Okay. So simply putting more money is not going to get you outcomes at the rate at the country needs them to be. Okay. Now, so the reason for writing a book after 20 years of kind of, writing individual papers, like many of you do, is really the common intellectual thread that motivates the book, okay? Is that multiple studies across sectors show that the social return on investment of investing in better governance and state effectiveness is often 10 times higher than simply spending more in a government as usual way, okay? So, and this is my life's work in half a slide, okay? So, and since this is an academic conference and not like, a policy one, I'll spend a little bit more time talking about each of these papers, and also for the younger researchers here, give you a sense of why the research matters, okay? And I'll spend more time on that, okay? But if you look at education, so 90% of our budget in education basically goes to teacher salaries and goes to unconditional increases of teacher salaries every time there's a pay commission, okay? But what the research shows is that an unconditional increase in teacher pay has absolutely zero impact on learning outcomes, zero, okay? Whereas if you manage to put even 3 to 5% of pay that is linked to any measure of performance, you get like a huge impact, okay? So I'm not saying don't pay our public servants well, but you have to pay in ways that are at least slightly linked to performance, right? Because otherwise you just, so that QJE paper is based on a doubling of teacher salaries, right? The government of Indonesia doubled salaries. We worked with them to randomize the rollout and studied that over 3 years. And the impact was exactly zero. Okay. So precise null. Okay. Not even like positive and insignificant, precise null. Okay. So that paper is called double for nothing. Okay. In contrast, that job market paper of mine, is where we found in Andhra Pradesh that 3%, 5% give you these huge impacts, okay? And then moving from education, like I said, I did 20 years of work in education, but then have also done a lot of work in welfare, in health, and child development. And the same pattern shows up again and again and again, okay? So in NREGS, what we found in our large-scale RCT, that's that AER paper, is that the biometric smart cards, the reduction in leakage from using the technology for payments was over 10 times the cost of the program. And then even more stunning was that recent Econometrica paper, where basically the biggest one key goal of NREGS is to improve the outside option of kind of landless laborers and improve the market wage, okay? And what we found is that the impact of improving implementation was bigger than the program itself, right? So think about how much time we spend trying to do impact evaluations of NREGA based on kind of the rollout, okay? The problem is even the Imbert and PAP paper can only find effects in the star states, right? Which are the well-implemented states, which basically means if you don't implement it, there's no effect. And better implementation had a bigger ROI than the entire program, okay? But think about where our political and legislative effort goes. It's in the program getting the budget and announcing it, right? But then the completely unglamorous day-to-day work of improving implementation is then something that we don't pay attention to. Okay, so there's a very nice qualitative mixed methods book by Rajesh Veeraraghavan called Patching Development, right? And he looks at Andhra Pradesh in particular about how they managed to do this so well. And what he shows is it's a continuous iterative process of improving implementation, right? Partly from top-down government, partly bottom-up civil society, but it takes commitment and consistency. And one of the reasons AP did that was they prioritized and, did that. So we can talk more about that in quick Q&A about NREGA. Okay, then education, again, we have this QJE paper showing that, providing schools with large unconditional grants, zero effect on learning, okay? But if you provide the grants and also have modest amounts of teacher performance-linked pay, huge benefits, okay? And that's kind of when the grants start getting used well. Otherwise, the grants are typically not used well, okay? Again, so education, we have this AR paper, showing how personalized adaptive learning can be incredibly effective. The bad news is if I go look at the budget of where the edtech budget of the government is going, it's all going to hardware, okay? And we have study after study showing that simply getting hardware has zero impact, okay? So again, the pattern in all of the research, right, is that the returns to governance and better delivery is way, way higher. Child development, JPE paper from 2 years ago based on a large-scale RCT in Tamil Nadu, where we find that putting an extra Anganwadi worker focused on early childhood education ends up giving you substantial improvements in learning outcomes and significant reductions in malnutrition because you're freeing up the time of the existing worker to spend more time. So this is what state capacity looks like, right? We heard yesterday about the abstract ideas of state capacity. It's like, now, how do you do this in practice? Okay, so these are then the nuts and bolts of how do you actually build state capacity. And then there's a very nice paper by Manaswini Rao looking at the judiciary, right? Which I think, we need a lot more high quality work on the judiciary, okay? Given how important it is, showing how an extra district judge clears another 200 cases a year. And because 60 to 70% of the cases are land and credit, which are the key factors of production that are being locked up when they're stuck in the courts, that extra district court judge leads to an increase in total economic activity, where they estimate that the ROI is about 30 times the cost of the judge. So the question here is that the reason for writing this book is to bring together all of this message from research and have this headline number as to say, guys, this is the most important cross-cutting thing we need to be focusing on as a country because the ROI is so high and it is so fundamental to kind of core public functions, okay? Now, so this is just a jhalak of the intro chapter of the book, okay? So this is an 18-chapter book. And what I realized, I was in Jadavpur 2 days ago and gave a talk on just chapter for 2 hours. So in future, I'll probably do more of these things. Today is just like a whirlwind tour, okay, of the big picture. But before we get into the details, right? So the technocratic core of the book is section 2 and 3, okay? As economists, the first question we ask is if you see $100 bill on the sidewalk, you say, why are people not taking it up? Okay, so there's a free lunch here, right? So what are the incentives that prevent us from taking this free lunch? Okay, and so that requires us to get into the black box of the two key actors of the state, who are the politicians and the bureaucrats. Okay, and it kind of requires understanding the incentives and the constraints under which these actors function. And again, the point in some ways is a lot of us who are outside government tend to have a very disdainful view, okay? We think of politicians as corrupt and power hungry. We think of bureaucrats as status seeking and risk averse. The truth is, if you spend a day in the lives of these guys and walk in their shoes, you'll just see how difficult their lives are, okay? So the kind of burdens a politician or a bureaucrat navigates is unimaginable to a typical academic who's at best dealing with some administrators and some. So that's why these two chapters are called the politician's predicament and the bureaucracy's burden. And to understand the politicians first, I think it's useful to, I'm going to take a 5-minute historical detour. I will probably go a little over time, excuse me. Okay, I know this is going to happen. I can predict rationally, okay? But so I think, but when I talked about the Indian state doing very well in some areas and not so well in other areas, the key is how we make sense of this, okay? And the key framework here comes from Francis Fukuyama at Stanford, where he talks about the scope of the state, which is everything that a government tries to do, and the strength of the state, okay, which is how effective are you at doing what you take on, okay? So before we kind of judge India, it's useful to take kind of a long-term 3,000-year historical view of the modern nation state, okay? And the key insight is that for most of human history, the nation state was essentially what I call a security state, okay? So the only thing that governments did was defense and law and order, right? And one way to measure this is that even in the 17th and 18th century, about 80% of budgets, okay, 70 to 80% of budgets in Europe were being allocated to defense and law and order, okay? Now, it's not like they never built roads. They did build roads, but the roads were built mainly for military logistics, okay, to get the troops from one end to the other faster. Any economic benefits were ancillary, okay? So, and it's not, again, that they didn't do any welfare, okay? But that was secondary because the main job of the state was to secure the borders, okay? And as you see, as the world is increasingly moving to a bit more of a law of the jungle, you can kind of see why, okay? That's how historically, the world was shaped. Now, it's only in the 18th and 19th century, okay, and now I'm talking about high-income Western countries, that we get to the second phase of the modern state, okay, which I call the industrial state, which is when, for the first time, governments start having massive investments in public infrastructure, okay, roads, railroads, canals, ports, sewage systems. All of this really takes off in a big way only in the 19th century, okay? And it's not an accident that this happens at the same time as the Industrial Revolution. Because till then, production is small scale and decentralized. Okay. So it's only when you have massive economies of scale in production that it makes sense to invest in transportation and storage, right? So there's the complementarity between the production technology and the optimal public goods that kind of cater to that production technology. Okay. Now, the good news here is this is also the first time in human history when you start getting sustained per capita. Okay. So the first 3,000 years, it's not like there's no growth. Okay. There's economic growth, but the growth is absorbed by increasing population. Okay. So GDP per capita stays flat for 3,000 years. So when we say that India had this great share of the world economy, like in the 60s, that's true, but it's basically a population story, right? Not a productivity story. Okay. So in that period, kings and nobles are living better, right? So we think about the great fortunes of the Mughals, the fancy jewelry and all of that. The kings are living better because there is more peasants to tax, okay? But the actual quality of life of the peasant is unchanged, right? I mean, so it's only at that Industrial Revolution time, and that's 19th century, that you start seeing this increase in GDP per capita, okay? And that's because productivity increases are now so high that you see that increase, okay? But along with that increase comes a massive increase in inequality. Right? Because that inequality, like I said, the gains are going to people with the physical capital, the land, the financial capital, and the education. Okay, so those are the classes that are benefiting from the growth. So it's only in the last 100 years. It's only in the last 100 years, starting roughly around 1930, that you get the third phase of the modern nation state, okay, which is the welfare state, where now you have progressive taxation and governments come and saying, let's start distributing the benefits of growth more broadly through a combination of food security, unemployment insurance, pensions. And the two key insights here, right? One is welfare states are very expensive to build. So most countries built their welfare states only after reaching middle income status. Okay. So if you look at the fraction of welfare spending as a fraction of total expenditure, social expenditure as a fraction of GDP, you see it's like under 5% till about 1930. Okay. So it goes up a little bit after the Great Depression, but the real pickup happens after World War II. Okay. And that's because there's a whole bunch of reasons, lots of work on this. But the 30-second version is that welfare states are very, very expensive. Okay. So running a welfare state requires both the administrative capacity to tax and the political willingness to be taxed. Okay. So, and when are citizens willing to be taxed? It's at a time of an existential crisis like a okay, so which is why the war era is when the tax to GDP ratios go up so much because countries are mobilizing both fiscally and administratively for the war effort. And that's when the state capacity gets built. Okay. And then at the end of the war, the peace dividend is what gets converted into the modern welfare state. Okay. So this is just some historical context. Now, the second critical point to realize is that the scope of the state is highly correlated with the extent of democracy. Okay. And that is, you can see that the security state has no concept of individual rights or human rights. The king can pick you up and throw you in jail. You travel in Europe, you'll see the dungeons, you'll see the towers, and there's no questions asked, right? The security state, so it's a Hobbesian state, right? That says, we are willing to surrender a certain amount of rights because otherwise you have the law of the jungle and the sovereign can do what they want, okay? Now, the interesting thing about the industrial state is that this happens at a time of limited democracy. Okay. So the US and the UK like to go lecturing the world about democracy, right? But in practice in that 19th century, they were very, very flawed democracies where the vote was restricted to 20% of the population, white property owning men. Okay. So it's not an accident that that is the demographic that gives you the political support for the infrastructure build out. Okay. Because in the long term, the infrastructure benefits the poor through market integration and lower prices. But in the short term, it's all capitalized in property prices, and it's the folks who own the factories who are benefiting from that transport infrastructure. Okay, so that is the elite property owning, capital owning class that gives you support for that massive infrastructure build out. Okay, and it is not an accident that the welfare state happens only after universal franchise. It's only when the vote is then expanded to all citizens that you get the political push for the welfare state. And that's because in any income distribution, if I'm on the right of the mean, I want lower taxes. If I'm on the left, I want more redistribution. And maybe that's where the terms right and left come from. Okay, like just looking at the shape of a distribution. Okay, now, why am I giving you this 7-minute capsule history of 3,000 years of the state? You can see where I'm going, okay? And that's because India is this complete outlier in modern human history, okay? So we are the only large country that had universal adult franchise on day one after independence, okay? And this is this really nice picture from Arvind Subramaniam and Rohit Lamba's JEP paper, And it just highlights Indian exceptionalism, okay, vis-a-vis being a democracy, okay? So now this is a wonderful thing, right? It's had many amazing benefits, right, of democracy before development. And the first is just that it's been a great moral triumph, right? So when we say that India has global soft power by virtue of being a democracy, it's basically because people recognize that this is a moral triumph that has given a voice to the most marginalized at a time when the historical counterparts did not have that voice, okay? Now, but it's also led to substantive policy wins for the poor. So my favorite example of this is the US does food stamps for the poor in the 1930s at a GDP per capita PPP inflation adjusted of $18,000 per capita. Okay, India does PDS for universal food security in the 1960s at a GDP per capita of about $1,200 PPP. Okay, so at 1/15th that income. Right. Recently, in the US presidential elections, Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, was proudly talking about doing free school feeding at $80,000. Okay. Whereas India has been doing midday meals like, well before that. Okay. So, and there's a ton of evidence, both cross-sectional as well as kind of quasi-experimental, on the relationship between the franchise and welfare. Okay, so my favorite micro-identified paper, and this is Tom Fujiwara's Econometrica paper, right? Like in Brazil, where you have this beautiful natural experiment that extends the franchise, and you see how that actually translates to increased healthcare spending, which is the biggest part of welfare. Okay, so these are the benefits. But of course, there are also two fundamental costs. Okay, and we're economists. We know there is no free lunch. Okay, so the fundamental challenge is that it has led to an expansion of the scope of the state well before we have the strength to meet that expanded scope. Okay, and that's because you have created ability to demand from the state, but the state itself doesn't have either the fiscal or the administrative capacity to meet all of those demands. Okay, and so that gets you into two vicious cycles. The first is the public finance challenge, okay, which is that voter demand and political supply of welfare at a much lower level of income squeezes funds for investing in public goods, including the state itself, okay? And you can see this in sector after sector after sector, right? How for railways, we famously, I think for 50 years after independence, over 95% of the Indian rail capital stock was laid by the British. And that's because we kept cross-subsidizing passenger fares and never having enough money to invest, okay? You kept cross-subsidizing in a way that freight was deprioritized. And so, Devesh Kapoor says how Indian railways trains at a glance, we'll have the timetable. But the Indian goods trains never had a timetable, okay? You could never know. Malgadi mein kab pahunchega pata nahi tha, okay? And so that was an example of kind of prioritizing kind of a certain amount of welfare and distribution at the cost of the investments in the public goods that would boost productivity. You see this in cross subsidies of electricity. You see this in cross subsidies everywhere, that a big driver of the lack of competitiveness of Indian industry, say, is that industrial electricity tariffs are significantly higher than cost because of the cross subsidy of kind of residential and agricultural rates, especially agriculture. Okay. So the problem is not welfare spending per se. Let's be very, very clear. Okay. In fact, there's a lot of high quality research that shows well-designed and implemented welfare can promote both equity and efficiency, okay? The problem is not welfare. The problem is badly designed and badly implemented welfare, okay? So that's one key challenge. The second key challenge is the political economy challenge, right? Which is, and we see this for comparative politics, folks, we see this in Africa as well, okay? That essentially when the claims in the state exceed the capacity to meet it, both the voters and the politicians rationally know that they don't have resources for everybody, okay? So the nature of the politics then becomes, how do I direct the limited resources of the state to my preferred voter group as opposed to building broad-based public goods, okay? And this is accentuated by the mathematics of first past the post, okay? So often in like elections in UP and Bihar in the 90s, you could win with like under 30 to 35% of votes cast. And because only 50 to 60% of people turn out, you could win with under 20% of the registered voters. Okay. And so that profoundly changes electoral incentives to have a committed base vote who will show out rather than appealing to the median vote. Okay. So our entire median voter theorem in political economy is kind of just goes out of the window. And then the mechanics of the incentives go towards the base vote. That's what gives you vote bank politics. Okay. And so why does every party therefore then need its vote bank? It's because you need that vote bank to come show up. Okay. And that in turn means that you don't have the incentives to invest in the broad purpose public goods. And this is a huge literature, right? Alessina, La Ferrera, Elf, this is shown in many contexts, right? That fractionalized societies find it harder to do that. And one of the mechanisms is here. Okay. So this is why the summary of all of this is, if you read summaries of Indian democracy by Ashu Varshini, Ram Guha, etc., they'll all say 50-50 or like glass half full, okay? And I'm telling you why, okay, which is the glass half full, is that Indian democracy has provided all citizens the capacity to make a claim on the state. The glass half empty is it has not created the incentives to invest in the capacity to meet those claims, okay? So now at one level, this sounds like we're stuck in a trap, okay? So how do you get out of this, right? So here's the good news. So the good news is that with education, with technology, the nature of politics is changing, okay? So the way I say this is there is an old politics of identity and polarization, language, religion, caste, community, region, okay? And there is a new politics of governance and service delivery, all right? Now, I'm not saying that the old politics is over. The old politics is very much there, okay? But the old politics only gets you 20% of the vote, right? So, and that's no longer enough to win. So to win for that next 20%, you increasingly have to deliver, right? So which is why the politicians are today desperate to figure out how are they going to deliver in ways that kind of get them that next fraction, okay? Again, it's not like they've stopped the polarization. That is there, okay? That is still, if you're a regional party, you have one dimension. If you're a national party, you have other dimensions. So the dimensions of polarization have not gone away, okay? But you still need that next piece of services. So that is the reason to be optimistic, because today the politicians want to deliver. And almost every politician I met in the past 2 years blames the bureaucracy, okay? They say like, hum karna chahte hain, ye babu log kuch karte nahi hai, okay? I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, okay? But that is also unfair. And that is unfair because it reflects decades of underinvestment in the bureaucracy, okay? You simply have not built the capacity of those public systems to now deliver what you want to deliver, okay? So we might have all these grand goals of growth and development, but you haven't invested in the vehicle that's going to get you there, okay? So my summary, and in the interest of time, I cut out my entire details, pathologies of the bureaucracy slide, okay? It's in chapter 3. But the summary analogy I use is just like the 1950s ambassador car, okay, was the metaphor of the pre-liberalization Indian economy. That 1950s ambassador is still a good metaphor for the Indian state, okay? That over time you have kept on adding burdens to this ambassador because expectations keep growing, but you haven't invested in the car itself, right? Now, your bureaucrats are like the engine, the body, and the wheels of this car. They're desperately trying to keep it moving, okay? They would prefer to be in a Ferrari, but there's no time to redesign this car, right? Because everybody is just, that's why I'm saying, if you spend a day in the lives of their office, a typical finance secretary will have, a budget of 3 lakh crores a year, okay? And which means, and the bureaucratic incentives are not to kind of do great things, it's to not make a mistake, okay? So if you get one file wrong, something goes wrong, there is what they call the 4C, the CVC, the CI, and the courts, okay? So, which means that your entire, it's just about institutional incentives, right? Like it means your normal, rational people functioning in an incentive system that has very little incentive to do things. It just has incentive for things to not go wrong, okay? And so, which means that it's going to take, so we are in a low-level equilibrium, right? A low-level equilibrium, but the politicians are frustrated, the bureaucrats are frustrated, okay? And that's what gives me hope that there is a window when you can kind of create and both galvanize the desire to act and provide a roadmap on how to act, okay? So which is what kind of the broader goal of this book is, okay? So we're just getting started, right? So because this is just giving you a jhalak up to chapter 2 and 3, right? Now, the core of the book, and why it's big, okay? But I promise you it's a very, very easy read, okay? But the core of the book is really this section, which is building an effective state, okay? And there are 3 points I want to highlight about this section of the book, okay? The first is that these principles of effective organizations apply to any org, okay? It's not just government. Applies to the private sector, applies to nonprofits, okay? And in a way, the organizing framework here is not coming from economics. It's coming from organization theory, okay? And so if you think about it, any private sector org, what drives org culture is what are your quarterly metrics and targets, right? So what do you measure is what you get, right? So the data and the measurement and the outcomes drive the culture of the entire org, okay? Second is people. So Bloom and Van Reenen again show, right, like that more than strategy, more than operations, 70% of org effectiveness, the single most important, not 70%, but the largest, 70% was Jack Welch. So Jack Welch, as CEO of GE, said he spends 70% of his time on HR. He said, like, my most important job is finding the right person, putting them in the right role, right targets, and giving them the right support, okay? That if I find that, the org will run itself, okay? That I don't need to worry about strategy. I don't need to worry about this thing. It's all about finding the right people in the right place and investing in leadership, okay? So So personnel, and this is now borne out by formal quantitative research, not just Jack Welch impressions, that you've got a Bloom and Van Rieden agenda now showing you, okay, with meticulous measurement and management practices across 15,000 companies around the world over 15 years, showing that more than strategy, more than ops, it's personnel, it's HR management. That's the single. Okay, so and hiring, training, posting, performance measurement, performance management, promotions. Okay, so the values you promote for effectively become the values of an organization. Okay, so personnel is central, right? Then you've got your third key piece, which is public finance and expenditure, which is how am I spending my limited money? Okay, am I spending when the ROA is high, or am I wasting my money? Right. The fourth is what's my revenue model? So the government might have the ability to coerce taxes, but that's not unlimited. You still need a viable revenue model, right? Federalism and decentralization. If I'm a global multinational, I have to worry about what am I doing in global headquarters, national headquarters, field headquarters, right? So the same logic applies to a complex multi-hierarchical governance setup. What do I do at national? What do I do at state? What do I do at local? Okay. And then there's the last dimension, going back to post 1937, right? The boundaries of the firm, which is what are the activities you do inside the boundary and what do you do outside? So what is core and what do you outsource from other players? Okay. And these are all core determinants of organizational effectiveness. Okay. Now, the next 6 slides are going to be very depressing, but also very optimistic, okay? They're depressing because they tell you how dysfunctional we are, okay, on all 6 of these measures. But they're optimistic because it tells you that if you're at such a low base and still doing well, that you can do so much better, okay? And it gives you a roadmap of how to do better, okay? So point 1 about this is the organizing framework. Point 2 is that there has been a ton of high quality micro research in each of these areas. Okay, so everything I'm saying is now bringing together a body of high quality evidence. Okay, and then putting it in this organizing framework that then allows us to connect the dots between these individual papers. And the third, and this is inspired by, so Greg Mankiw, who is my macro teacher, right? So when he came back to Harvard from 2 years in DC as CA to Bush, he wrote a very nice JEP paper on the macroeconomist as scientist and engineer, okay? So the whole point is that as economists, so we're both scientists who want to understand the world, and Aprajit is here, right? And engineers, like, who want to take that understanding and build a better world, okay? So similarly, the chapters are structured in these 2 halves of the first half is social science. Okay, so let's understand the facts, the principles, and why things are the way they are. The second half is systems engineering. Okay, how do you take that understanding, that scientific understanding, and build something that is better? Okay, so that's the sense in which it is optimistic, but realistically optimistic, right? It doesn't sugarcoat the problems, as you'll see. Okay, so let's get on with that. All right, so then 1 slide on each of these topics. Okay. And like I said, it's all based on research. Right? So data and measurement. So here is this very, very striking picture, okay? And it's coming from a study by Abhijit Singh based in Madhya Pradesh. So, I've been working on education policy, helping with 12th plan, helping with many, many policy documents. And we've been saying since 2009, okay, that we need universal foundational literacy and numeracy. We need to be measuring learning outcomes. We need to make sure that the systems are doing. And to be fair to government, so this is why I'm so sympathetic. You see, there are many officers who took that message very seriously, starting in Gujarat itself, okay, where in fact, the current PM, when he was CM, invested in Gunotsav, where he would send top officers to go to the field, spend time, and they really invested in measurement of learning of every student. Madhya Pradesh did even more. They did this thing called Pratibha Parv. So this was considered a national best practice, okay, in 2015 for measuring learning outcomes, okay. Now, the bad news is that along comes Abhijit Singh and decides to go and do an audit study, okay, where he goes back and resamples a fraction of the same children, them on exactly the same questions, okay. And what you see is in the official data, there is no child scoring below 65%, okay. That's the top line. In the independent audit data, you see how much below that is. There is no child scoring above 65%. Okay, so that is how much the data in the official records is inflated. Okay. And I remember in 2002, one of my first field studies, I was doing this study on teacher absence and I went to MP. It was an MP actually, not picking on MP. This is true in other states too. Okay. But I remember going to the school at 11 o'clock, teacher's absent, school is closed. But in the 5th standard board exam, the school is scoring 100%. Okay. So I'm finding out, ye kaisa ho raha hai? And then somebody told me, sir, yahan pe board exam ka matlab hota hai, answer board pe likha hota hai. So now, But but the thing is, it's not, I mean, at one level it's funny, but another level, this is a national tragedy, right? Why is this a national tragedy? Because it explains how we have wasted 20 years as a country, okay, on something as basic as foundational learning. Why? Because since 2005, Pratham has been doing household surveys saying that kids are not learning. That's not biased by composition, public, private, whether you're at home attending, whatever, right? So we know the kids are not learning. But the problem is that, and this is where you have to sympathize with the bureaucrat, right? Because what many joint secretaries in education will do, in private, they will admit that. But in public, they have to work with official data because that is, the official data is what they are supposed to accept. And in the official data, there's no problem. So how are you even going to acknowledge the problem? How are you going to start if you can't acknowledge the problem? Right? So, and this is not dur ki baat nahi hai. Ye aaj ki tragedy hai. Okay. In the past year, we have seen data from multiple states, even some of the better performing states. Okay. If you look at child malnutrition, same story. In the official data in the Anganwadis, the rate of severe malnutrition is reported as 1%. Rate of normal malnutrition is reported as 5 to 8%. This is in a high performing state. Okay. But in the independent NFHS, severe malnutrition is 8%. Okay. That's 8 times higher. So now think about how are we going to get to Viksit Bharat, okay, if we don't fix this foundation? Because our entire policy for malnutrition is when I identify a malnourished child, here is the downstream action that is supposed to be taken. Severely malnourished, huh? We're talking about Z-score below -3. There is no actual action protocol at -2. The action protocol kicks in at severely malnourished, okay, which is in the bottom 1%, not even bottom 5%. But if you're misclassifying 85% of the children, again, you're not going to start the downstream action, right? And so that's why the data is just foundational to anything you do. Otherwise, we'll just be talking about schemes and targets, but like these are the foundational aspects of state capacity, of how does the state actually function in the last mile. Okay. Second key piece, personnel. Okay. So what is state capacity? But for people, for the citizens' perspective, the government employees are the state. Okay, so yeah, time. You know, you guys are looking worried. Can I go to 1:30? Thank you. Okay. 1:30, then I will stay. Okay, I will skip lunch and I'll stay. Okay. All right. But let's just look at, let's look at employees. Right? What most people don't understand is the Indian state is the most understaffed in the world. By far. Okay, so we think we have this big bloated bureaucracy. The problem is we have bloated bureaucracy where we don't need them, and where we need them, we don't have enough people. So, like Scandinavian welfare states have actually 10 times the per capita public employees. Even a country like the US that we think of as this paragon of free markets is 5 times. China is 3.5 times. Okay, so why do we have so few public employees? The answer is in the other side of the picture. And that's because Indian government employees are by far the most overpaid in the world. Okay. Now, this is not true at the top 2%. Okay. But what you have in government pay in India is massive wage compression. Okay. Where the top 2% of leaders who are making all the decisions relative to that human capital are massively underpaid relative to what they would command in the private sector. But the bottom 95% of government jobs pay 5-10 times the market wage. So here is from a study in Andhra Pradesh where we look at government teacher salaries. This is from 2010. Government teacher salaries about 6 times on average private school salaries. And one of my easiest ways of figuring out how disconnected some elite members are from average is to ask them, what do you think is the ratio of salaries of government and private school teachers? And most people will think private school teachers get more because you're looking at the right tail elite private schools. On average, government school teachers get about 5-6 times. And if you go to UP, that number is 10 times. 10 times. Okay. So it's crazy, right? So, and that's why you don't have the money to hire. Because all of your money is going on these unconditional pay increases. Remember that I said was double for nothing? Right? Now, this is not just the problem of state capacity. Right? So at one level, the tragedy is I'm spending my money the wrong way. Okay. Econ 101 is you should pay less and hire more. But it's a much bigger problem than that. The bigger problem is what we don't appreciate enough is the spillovers from the structure of public sector labor markets into the overall economy. Okay, so we're all talking about jobs. We're all talking about skills. The reason we do so badly is this picture. Why? Because Essentially, the biggest driver of unemployment in India is educated youths writing government exam after government exam after government exam after government exam. And that's because the government job is so lucrative relative to the market. So we get all these media reports of 200 applicants per government job. I think there was one where 368 PhDs in UP applied for the job of a peon. Okay. And we look at all of this and we say, oh, the market is not creating jobs. That's not the right interpretation. The market does create jobs, but the market creates jobs at market wages. It's the government that's so completely out of whack with the market that distorts the entire labor market. Okay. And this is a study in Tamil Nadu, okay, by Kunal Mangal, right? That's in the JDE. And he estimates that even in Tamil Nadu, that's the most industrialized state in India, does the best job in creating these jobs, these kind of blue-collar, labor-intensive jobs. Even in Tamil Nadu, he estimates that 80% of all unemployment of educated youth in their 20s is people writing government job exam after government exam after government exam. Okay. So that is the distortionary effect on the overall labor market. But it's worse than that. It's worse than that. So why do we have an education system that has millions of graduates but no skills? Right? Because the tail that wags the dog of the education system is the labor market. And the most lucrative employer in the economy doesn't care about skills, cares only about exam taking. So if the most lucrative employer in the economy is only rewarding rata marke exam pass karo, then that's the tail that wags the dog of the entire education system. So why do you not have skilling? It's not just lack of supply, it's lack of demand. People keep dropping out. They drop out because they would rather go back and try this lottery. So that's an example of the GE costs of the structure of public sector labor markets that we've not even remotely started estimating. So I have a PhD student now who's actually working on a macro labor model to kind of quantify the overall misallocation that results as a result of this structure. So some really interesting work happening here. Okay. I think the problem is the reason I'm going even longer today is this academic audience. So I'm talking even more about the research underlying things as opposed to just the high level. Okay. So I'm going to skip some stuff. But here is a picture that is probably one of the most important conceptual frameworks in the entire book. Okay. That if you're in the private sector, you can't spend 10 crores without a discounted cash flow explaining to your CFO, why should I make this investment? In the government, you can routinely spend 1,000 crores, like without any basic discipline, as long as procedures are followed. Okay. So the first point of quality of expenditure is, can you have the discipline of estimating the ROI in some broad sense of public spending? But obviously the government is not an enterprise. We also have social obligations. So we care about equity. So what you can do is you can take every major category of public spending, and there's enough thesis topics here for hundreds of master students. Okay. And basically think about categorizing spending on this 2x2 axis of equity and efficiency. Right? And the thing is, you'll find policies all over the place. Okay. So an example of a policy in region 2 would be moving to a uniform GST, right? That would substantially improve efficiency of tax collection, reduce compliance cost, and make economic activity much smoother. But it would be regressive. And therefore, that would be in that quadrant. Right? Our combined food economy of procurement and PDS probably sits down here because it contributes to food security, but creates all these distortions in the food economy. Okay. So now reasonable people can argue over region 2 versus region 4 based on whether you prioritize equity or efficiency. And that's really a function of your discount rates. Okay. So if you have a lower discount rate, you prioritize efficiency. If you have a high discount rate, like Kane said, in the long term, we're all dead. If you're a high discount rate, then you want to bring forward that stream of consumption. Okay. So it's basic econ for how you do that. But what I want to call attention to is that every year we spend lakhs of crores on items in region 3 that are bad for both equity and efficiency. And as a result, we don't have the money to spend on region 1 ideas that will improve both equity and efficiency. Okay. So my favorite example of this is again that second Anganwadi worker. Right. So we estimate that this would have an ROI of 20x, 2000% based on the calculated long-term returns of that investment in early childhood. And it will disproportionately benefit the poor and the marginalized because all the rich kids are in private preschool. So in fact, Abhijit Singh and Maurizio and Peter Berg have this very nice EJ paper looking at the value added of public and private preschools in Tamil Nadu. And what they show is most of the learning gap between public and private schools emerges in preschool. Okay, it's less in the primary school itself, it's in preschool. And that's because in your Anganwadis, what we are seeing in the time in use is they're basically treated as feeding centers and very little actual instruction is happening. Okay, so that is how high the ROI there would be. But all the money goes to unconditional salary increases of existing workers. And every politician, when you say, ha, salary badha denge. Right? That's because the politics always favors the insiders, because that's where the union is, right? Rather than kind of the public interest. So similarly on rural development, probably our single worst policy as a country in many states is the free electricity for farmers. There's almost no more destructive policy we have in this country. It may have made sense in the 1960s when we were facing a national food security crisis. But think about the equity. If you do the incidence analysis, the top 5% of landowners capture over 50% of the subsidy, because the subsidy is proportional roughly to land holding, right? It is single-handedly responsible for the depletion of our groundwater table to the point where essentially the biggest crisis for India's future is, I don't know how many of you know, 80 to 90% of all water in India is used for agriculture. Okay, so that distorts that. It hurts industry because you cross-subsidize and overcharge industrial tariff to cover, because in principle, the finance department should cover the subsidy. In practice, the discoms don't get the full amount, so they cross-subsidize. And that in turn becomes a huge driver of lack of competitiveness of Indian industry in terms of electricity costs. In fact, it's so funny. I remember I was working in Maharashtra textile department, and the policy they were proudest of for textiles was electricity subsidy. Okay, for this thing. So I'm like, why are you doing a subsidy? And I thought this was distortionary. But then I did the analysis and saw what the subsidy was doing was undoing the distortion of the cross subsidy. You see? So it was just the subsidy was being brought to bring back the price to what the actual cost of production was. Okay. So these distortions that we do with price and subsidies is insane. Okay. And it's probably one of the single drivers of kind of the pollution in the northern belt, because a big contributor is stubble burning of places that have no business growing paddy in the first place. So you take away the free water, the free electricity, the paddy goes away from places that should not be growing paddy. Right? So that's an example of economic analysis, like that then feeds through, and the GE effects. Why do we need economic thinking? As opposed to just because bureaucratic thinking and accountant thinking is, can I afford it? Can I implement it? Economic thinking is general equilibrium thinking. Yeah? And can you go beyond that to think about the price and distortions and spillovers to the entire economy? And that's the one key thing that makes economic thinking different. Okay, so the point is, this gives us a framework by which you can substantially improve quality of expenditure. Right? The book is called Accelerating India's Development. And remember, my premise here was it's not about spending more, because A, we don't have the money. So how are you going to do better? The only way to do better is to do it smarter. Okay, so revenue, I'm going to skip beyond just saying that we don't have enough. Okay, and this is our tax to GDP ratio. It's about 17 to 18%, and we already have a very high level of deficits. Right, combined state and central deficit is about 8%. Interest payments take up about 25% of all current expenditure. So that's current spending going for past borrowing. So the borrowing space is very, very low. Okay. And for those of you in research, I think the most important question in revenue, when we think about tax and revenue, is not quantity, but quality of revenue. Okay, so just like, we have, so the key idea here is marginal cost of public funds, right? So the cost of a rupee of tax revenue is not 1 rupee, right? It's much higher because it includes administrative cost, compliance cost, and the incentive effects of distortion of economic activity, right? So we also care about looking at the portfolio of tax instruments and improving kind of the quality of revenue, all right? So there's a whole bunch of ideas in chapter 7 that, you can go engage with on that, okay? Then here's another critical cross-cutting piece. And the cross-cutting piece is federalism and decentralization. Okay, and one of the reasons our service delivery in the last mile is so weak, probably the biggest reason, is that India is by far the most over-centralized country in the world. Okay, so if you measure centralization by, and I think this is what Mahendra Devji was referring to yesterday as well, if you measure this by what fraction of total spending happens at the local government level, in large federal polities like the US and Brazil, that's about 25%. Okay, India is 3%. Now, this is from 2015. I think that number has now gone up to about 5%. But maybe you take out Maharashtra. Maharashtra is the one exception. They decentralize about 25%. You take out Maharashtra and Kerala, it falls back to 3%. Okay. Now, the most important insight is not that. The most important insight is China, right? Because China is the only other comparable country of similar size. And China is the most decentralized country in the world. Over 50% of total spending happens at local government level. Okay, and that's basically because service delivery functions, education, health, all of these are local government. And that's what allows you to ensure that the teachers show up and the doctors show up, because there's accountability there. For 20 years, those of you know, my first, study and still my most highly cited paper was just measurement, right, of teacher and doctor absence. But 20 years later, we've not been able to crack that problem. No chief minister I've met is able to solve the problem because the unions are just. So the way you solve this problem is not by saying I'll do biometrics and cameras and more top-down stuff. The way you solve it is by giving the power to the ultimate stakeholder, that's the community. Okay, and we can come back and talk about much more of this later, why we're over-centralized. That's why at Jadavpur 3 days ago, I gave a 2-hour lecture just on this slide and ran out of time. Okay, so just because there is so much kind of research, right, and conceptual frameworks that underpin how we think about these complex issues. Okay, but here's the other point. The other subtle point is everybody thinks they're over-centralized mainly from center to state. No, the bigger over-centralization is from state to local. Okay, so if you look at the distribution of personnel, which is head count, you'll see in the US and China, over 60% of employees are local. Okay, in India, that's 10%. This is from Devesh Kapoor. Okay, and where that flip is happening, is mainly at state. Okay, and we can talk in Q&A if we have time into lunch, haha, and about why we are the way we are. Okay, but I'll pause that. And then the last part is state in the market. So one of the consequences of a weak public sector is mass exit to the private sector. Over 50% of primary schooling in urban India is private. Health is 70%. Private security in India today employs 3.5 to 4 times as much as all public security forces put together. Okay, and so at one level, this is potentially a good thing because it is freeing up the public resources for those who can't afford to go to the private. But at a deeper level, it's a problem because it means that Indian elites have completely seceded from being recipients of public services. So why do we not have the political will to do more about this? Because anybody who matters is not using public services. Right? So there's a nice paper recently showing that public services used by elites like airports have improved. Right? But public services that elites have seceded from have essentially stayed flat. Okay, so, and this is what Ravi Kambur was talking about yesterday. Remember when he said if you target completely, having a broader coalition of people who are using public services also then helps. See, I was not here yesterday because I was stuck in government meetings, but I was listening as much as possible. Okay, whenever I was between sessions. Okay, so, but there's a big political economy to this, but there's also a pure policy piece. Okay, which is one of the trickiest parts that most policymakers in India don't understand. Okay, or at least don't act on, is that the government plays 3 very distinct roles in the economy. You are a policymaker, you're a regulator, and you're a provider. Okay, as a policymaker, the private sector is your ally because you care about delivering for citizens regardless of who's doing the delivery. As a regulator, you have to treat the private sector equally. As a provider, the private sector is your competition, right? Because you're competing for market share. So what happens is because 95% of government budgets and personnel are allocated to government as provider, the government only thinks about its role as a provider. Okay, whereas we've got some beautiful research by Jishnu, and then I think Farzana has similar work in education in India that basically shows that working to make markets work better can have huge positive effects. But that requires really taking the regulation function seriously and saying, how do you regulate better to make markets work better? Okay, so there's a whole set of principles in that in chapter 9. And then there's a related part, which is how do you better outsource and do PPPs? Okay, but even that requires state capacity. One of the reasons it doesn't work is you need the government to be an effective regulator. You need the government to be able to write effective contracts, and that's not easy. So you need state capacity even to leverage the markets. Okay, so like I said, I promised you I was going to be optimistic. Okay, so one part of the optimism is just the second half of each of those chapters. So there are evidence-based ideas that are practical, doable ideas for every one of these problems. Okay, that's why I could easily do 2 hours on each chapter. This is just a jhalak to get you to go read it. Okay, so let me take my last 10 minutes and kind of get to another big picture and the second half of the book. Okay, because the thing I struggled the most with the book was the title. So the title went through 4 iterations, right? It was variants of state capacity. But in the end, you realize that this public doesn't care about state capacity. Public cares about development. State capacity is an instrument to get you development. Okay, so which is why the title is Accelerating India's Development. But the two halves of the book are, the first half is how you get there. The second half is where do you use that state capacity, right? Because you can use state capacity in suboptimal ways as well. So that capacity has to be used in ways that serve citizens and not kind of further pervert the state away from public interest. Okay. So what I want to do here is just really just talk about chapter 10, okay, which is one of the key conceptual chapters that's a bridge and introduction to the second half of the book, okay? And so here is perhaps the big debate in global development for the last 50 years, okay, which is the growth versus development debate, or in India, it's the Bhagwati Sen debate, okay? So just 3 days ago, I was in Jadavpur, so I've spanned like Amartya Sen's home, and now here I'm, I guess, in the Bhagwati land, okay? So, and here's the basic point, okay? The basic point is that on every development indicator, richer countries on average do better, okay? So on education, on health, on life expectancy, on everything, okay? And richer states in India on average do better, on average, okay? So essentially the growth view, which is the Bhagwati Panagriya view, is to say, guys, get 2% higher growth consistently for 40 years. Everything else will take care of itself, okay? Let's get that growth going, and that'll unleash what we need. On the other hand is the Amartya Sen's view that says the point of development is not GDP. The point of development is human capabilities. And you can't eat GDP. What matters is, do you have the agency to be well-functioning independent agents? For that, education, health, human development are key things. And in India, the Kerala-Gujarat comparison would probably be the starkest illustration there. By Gujarat, in fact, I was stunned. I didn't realize that the stunting numbers for Gujarat are below national average. It's like 38% compared to a national average of 35. Okay, so clearly that has been this big argument. Now, my own view here is to say at some level, they're both right? Because clearly more growth gets you more human development. And more human development is not only intrinsically good, but also gives you growth. So what are we fighting about? Okay, so in the end, it becomes an ideological fight that the center right wants more capex and the center left wants more social sector spending. So my point of departure in this debate is to say 50 saal bahut ho gaya, because this is fundamentally a zero-sum fight about budget allocation. So whereas my point is to say, guys, the problem is not where you're spending the money, but the translation of spending into outcomes is so bad, regardless of whether you're doing capex or social sector, that if you focus on building a more effective state, you can do more of everything. Right? And so connecting this to macro development, which are the things, these are the things I can't do in just like a policy talk, right? So there's this nice Francesco Caselli paper looking at kind of cross-country variation in GDP per capita in a growth accounting framework. And basically the estimates would show that about 20% of the variation is physical capital, 20% is human capital, and 60% is TFP. So in that framework, you could think about the growth wallas as the physical capital people, the development wallas as the human capital people, and I'm coming along and trying to be the TFP walla, okay? And saying, guys, that's where the action is. And we now have so much research to inform understanding of that TFP. See, because TFP is what Bob Solow famously called a measure of our ignorance, right? It is a residual after you put everything you can measure in that aggregate production function. And what we don't understand is in that residual. Okay, but if you think about the Bloom Van Reenen agenda, if you think about the RCTs I'm summarizing, a lot of this is then getting into the black box of the TFP of the state and saying, how do you unpack that amorphous theta into things that will build a more effective state? Okay, so this is why it gets longer in an academic conference. Okay, so this is the optimism. The optimism is that this is perhaps the single biggest triumph of development in the second half of the 20th century. Okay, which is the shifting of the Preston curve. That on the x-axis is GDP per capita, y-axis is life expectancy. This is what this is in 1930. In 1960, that shifts up. In 2015, that shifts up even further. So what that means is at the same level of income, over time, countries are able to deliver better and better outcomes. And what has been the key driver of that magic? It is newer technologies, right? So particularly in health, right? 100 years ago, the year the book came out, 1924, the president of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, could not save his son from dying from a bacterial infection that he got while playing tennis. He stubbed his toe and got a blister and died within a week. The president of the United States. That's because there was no germ theory of disease, there was no antibiotics. Okay? The net cost of COVID to humanity would have been tens of trillions higher if we had not compressed the time cycle of finding that vaccine. Okay, so if you then think about the grand arc of human progress, okay, most progress in the last 200 years, which is when, remember, GDP per capita starts growing, comes from the creation of new knowledge, the transmission of that knowledge, and acting on that knowledge. Okay. And health as a field is perhaps the field that has the best established traditions of evidence-based medicine that then get reflected in professional syntheses and practice. So what I'm arguing with this book is that how do you shift the precedent in every development field? And the way to ask that question is to say, what do today's low-income countries have that today's high-income countries did not have when they were at a similar level of development? And it's basically the two key things we have are much, much better data and evidence and much better technology. So again, yesterday, Mahendra Dev mentioned how he was punching cards for his dissertation, right? So if you think about what's happened in the last 20 years, there's been an explosion, right, in economic knowledge, explosion of micro data sets, of computing power, of research methods that's like taught us so much that we just did not know. Okay. And that's where you get this free lunch. And that's because there's enormous opportunities to improve spending quality. We have many very, very expensive policies and programs that have little or no impact. Other much less expensive interventions that are not being done because we're not spending our money right. And since all of you are researchers, this is why the research enterprise is so important, right? That's because I don't care about how Maruti makes its cars because they face market prices for inputs and market prices for outputs. If they're not competitive, they'll be competed out. Whereas in government, you can waste other people's money badly for a very long time. Okay. So the value of research, therefore, in guiding expenditure in places where there's no market test, right, is extraordinarily high. And for those of us, any funders here of whether it's philanthropy or government, the reason public funding of research is so important is that, you see this bit of a backlash in the US pointing out to, oh, this nonsensical study, why are we funding it? Okay. But that's completely the wrong way to think about it. The way to think about the social ROI on funding research is it's like early stage venture capital. Okay. Just like an early stage venture capital investor, 90% of your companies will fail. 9% will repay that investment, and 1% blockbuster success will pay for the entire portfolio. So similarly, the scientific enterprise is constantly a hope of reach against the unknown. Right? So by definition, most of the time you will fail. That's why the transition from a master's to PhD is so difficult. Because you're making the transition from being a high quality consumer of knowledge to being a tentative and mostly unsuccessful producer of knowledge. Because in expectation, a paper will be wrong. It is difficult. Okay, but if you think about the social enterprise, the total social value created by that one COVID vaccine paid off every piece of scientific research in the world for the past 2.5 decades. Right? So that's how you think about portfolio approaches to funding research. Okay, and why kind of the research enterprise and that scientific temperament is so important to kind of drive long-term growth. Okay, so let me just give you one example of the power of this kind of research and how it can change thinking. Okay, so this is from my own work on learning, and this is from a sample of 6,000 kids in Rajasthan in 4 districts, where because we have computer adaptive testing, you can calibrate the learning of every child to the grade level. Okay. And the x-axis here is the grade in which the student is enrolled. The y-axis is the learning outcome. If the children are making progress as per the curriculum, they should be on that 45-degree line. Okay. In practice, the true level of learning is about half of that. Is that red line? So the average 8th standard student has about a 4th standard level of learning. Okay. And further, because you have dynamic data on every child, you can pinpoint exactly where the child is. Because if you're getting the 8th standard question wrong, I'll give you 7th, 6th. I'll keep going easier till you get it, right? So then you see in that 8th standard class, there are children at a 2nd standard level, 3rd, 4th, all the way up to 8th. You look at that variation there. And you see that this is one of the unintended consequences of the well-intentioned no detention policy. That you kept pushing kids through to higher grades saying no detention. So it was well-intentioned because the worry that if you fail them, they'll drop out. But keeping them in this, promoting them is not solving the problem of learning. And so then you have this crazy situation in that 8th standard classroom. And then when we want to make sense of why is our budget not translating into outcome? Okay, so all the spending on buildings and books and stuff doesn't seem to matter. Now, one problem is governance, right? Because about 25% of teachers are absent. But now think about the 75% sincere teachers, okay, who are there and teaching very, very sincere. But what does a sincere teacher do? A sincere teacher takes the textbook, creates a portion, and then sincerely completes the portion in every lecture. So a sincere 8th standard teacher is going to be teaching the 8th standard curriculum, but which is going bouncer for the vast majority of kids. So இப்போ நிறைய பேருக்கு தெரியும் நான் என்ன பண்ண போறேன்னு, பிகாஸ் நான் இதே கிளாஸ்க்கு நடுவில் ஒரு வேற பாஷையில பேச ஆரம்பிச்சா நான் எவ்வளோ குவாலிஃபைடா இருந்தாலும் சரி, எவ்வளோ சின்சியரா இருந்தாலும் சரி, எவ்வளோ ஃபீலிங்கோட கமிட்மெண்ட்டோட ஸ்பீடா கத்து கொடுத்தாலும் சரி, ஆனா ஒரு 5% 10% புரியும். ஸோ எவ்வளவு பேருக்கு புரியறதோ கொஞ்சம் கை தூக்குங்க, நான் பார்க்கலாம் யாருக்கு புரியும். இந்த கிளாஸ்ல நிறைய நிறைய ரொம்ப நல்லா படிக்கிற குழந்தைகள் இருக்காங்க. ஸோ பட் எல்லாரும் இந்த குழந்தைகள் மாதிரி ஏன் படிக்க மாட்டேங்கிறா? இது பாரு எவ்வளவு சமத்தா படிக்கிறான். Right? So what have I just done to you? Okay. Right? I've just given you 30 seconds in the shoes of a typical kid in a typical classroom in lakhs of schools around the country. This is the daily lived reality of millions of children. Right? And then when you wonder, why it's a miracle that they don't drop out. Right? There is nothing more kind of depressing and enervating than being in that classroom, right? बच्चे मुरझा जाते हैं, right? So, but that's the point, right? Because we have, and even in private now, even like advocates of the RTE Act will tell me that we didn't build an RTE Act, we built a right to education facility. Because that is what the government knows to do in terms of schemes. We will build schools, hire teachers, give books. But how do you ensure the learning? It's a wicked problem. Okay, it's not an easy problem. But what the data and the research allows you to do is at least focus on the right problem. Because once you have that picture, then that tells you where you need to focus if you're going to move the needle. Right? So Gujarat Pratham data has been flat for the past 6 years. I checked all of this before my government meetings. Flat. This is a high-income state that knows how to get stuff done. Okay? So it's just about pointing that energy in the right way. Okay, so I promise. So, but here's then how we get optimistic, both realistic and optimistic. Okay, and today India's stunting rate is 35%. And if you look at just the income elasticity of income growth into stunting over the past 20 years, and simply project that at 6%, okay, even at 6% GDP per capita growth, which is kind of optimistic given the global headwinds we now face. Given all the chaos that's happening in global markets. Okay, doing 6% per capita is non-trivial. But even at 6%, in 2047, at our Viksit threshold, you will still have 25% children being stunted. 25%. China today is at 8%. Okay? And so the point is that it's not like we're not making progress. So remember, before we get pessimistic, see, I keep saying, like a good professor, my grade for India is a solid B+, okay? Which is, there's a lot to be proud of, but we can do better, right? Which is why I tell every student, that's how you keep getting better. And that B+ is not a subjective thing, okay? It's coming from this picture, right? If you look at this picture, we are exactly where you would predict based on income and slightly better. Okay, so it's a data-backed B+. I didn't just say that to sound nice. In some areas, we're an A-. Macro fiscal stability, probably an A- or an A. Why? Because elites care about that. So you can then decompose the performance based on which segment of the population. So that's an agenda for political economy people, right? So this is just opening up a whole bunch of research areas, okay, for people to go look at. I'm looking somewhere and smiling, So, all right. So the B+ is a very data-driven B+. So the question is, if you want to truly get Viksit, then you got to bend that curve. Now, one way to bend it is by growing faster. Now, if you grow at 8%, even if you grow at 8%, that barely moves. It gets better, but it moves from 25 to 22. And that's because the translation of income into outcomes has been so weak. Okay? But if you manage to double the efficiency of public spending going forward, then even at 6%, you can actually dramatically bend that curve. bend that from 25 to 70. And then the beauty is if you bend that curve, you're going to give yourself tailwinds for growth because that human capital is going to feed back. So that increases the chances that you will do 8%. And that gets you where you truly want to be to kind of get close to Viksit targets. Okay, now the doubling might be optimistic, but remember, I'm giving you many, many ideas in the book that have a 10x ROI. And I'm also being conservative by grandfathering past spending because I know the political economy of shifting existing spending is too difficult. But at least every year when the budget grows, if the marginal allocation of funding reflects some of these principles, that's how you will bend the curve. Right? And then investing in that independent measurement. So there's a whole menu of ideas of how you bring this together to make it happen. Okay, this is just the conceptual outline. All right. And same for learning outcomes. So today we have only 44% of children in rural India complete primary school being able to read at a second standard level. Second standard. This is not a high standard. Okay. Completing primary school at second standard level of this is basic reading. Okay. And on the current trajectory, even in 2047, that number only gets to 84%. But that same journey that I talked about can bring that to 2034. Okay. So why do I focus so much of my attention on early childhood development and school learning outcomes? Many reasons, right? One is because the future of these children is yet to be written. They're not yet born. So that 10 years is completely in our control. So we can shape that trajectory completely. Whereas if I try to do skilling for 18-year-olds, it's almost always too late. Second reason I focus so much is politically, there's much more focus on the 18-year-olds because they vote. And the children don't. So if you gave mothers an extra vote for every child they had, and representing kind of the future political economy, that would be an interesting exercise in kind of bending what the political objective function looks like. What does political representation of children look like? See, the biggest distortion in public finance, political economy, public finance, which were actually my two fields in grad school, I'm looking at Sabia, is like even in the US, is that this is not just India, okay, this is global. Even in the US, the single biggest misallocation of public resources is how much you overspend on health in the last 6 months of life relative to how little you spend in the first 3 years of life. That's because the medical industrial complex, with the Medicare kind of reimbursement formulas, drives the entire spending to that sliver. And that again reflects the political economy, but there's also very interesting, I could give a whole seminar just on that distortion, okay? But the point is, because the distortion exists, those of us who kind of shape public opinion need to be spending much more time where there is distortion and directing the attention to the issue matter, because this is where the foundation of Viksit Bharat will be laid. Okay, so to wrap up, okay, so this is then just the second half of the book. So obviously, so the funniest part of the book is people will often say it's too long, and then they'll say, why did you also not cover this? Okay. So in picking the topics, right, I've been very disciplined in kind of picking these 6 areas. And the logic of these 6 sectors is not just how important they are, but in doing them, you don't have to choose between Bhagwati and Sen. Because every one of them matters intrinsically for human development. And they also matter instrumentally for growth. Okay, that's true for education, it's true for health, it's true for safety, it's true for justice, right? So justice is economic, but justice is also fundamentally a human rights issue, right? 70% of our under trials are not guilty. They are incarcerated, awaiting trial. So that the judicial system is a human rights disaster. Okay, so that's the intrinsic part of it. And then there's the instrumental part of it, which is how many of your factors of production are locked up because of how slow the courts are. Okay, not to measure the investment that doesn't even happen, right? If you backward induce, this is the investment that happened and got stuck. Even if I release the capital, then if you do the optimal investment thing in that world of uncertainty, that uncertainty will always. So when we keep saying, why does private capital not invest? Every government official is breaking their head and asking private capital, why are you not investing? So of course, there is some global uncertainty, but there's also a ton of domestic uncertainty, right? So that's in our control. So if we just focus on what's in our control, we can do a lot. And then the last 2 chapters, see what I'm arguing here is, despite the political and bureaucratic pathologies, that there are many, many motivated, kind of sincere folks who want to act on this. And this is a roadmap for them. But recognizing that in the end, you still can't just say, hey, government will do this. You then have to think long term and saying, how do you make it happen so that it's not just a one-off that one officer says, I want to do this. And that requires you to reimagine institutions. And one key argument I make is that India's institutional architecture evolved in the 1950s, but that has kind of gotten weak in many, many, many ways. So one of the places where you kind of get green shoots of new ideas is then by looking at states and saying states are bigger than most countries. So can states lead thinking with regard to certain institutional reforms that then kind of tie their hands? Okay, so there are ideas here with regard to public finance, budget management, HR, just basics of saying that we will not politicize certain key aspects of how the state has to run. Because the whole point of institutions is it's like Odysseus tying himself to the mast, right? It is rationally that your short-term interest will get you away from your long-term interest. So rationally, both parties come together and tie their hands. Which is why institutions are normally built in constitutional moments when the people designing the rules of the game are thinking long-term and not just about their horizon and power. Okay, so we need to reinvest in a set of institutional imagination. But the beauty of working at the state level is it gives you 28 bites at the apple, right? And that increases the chances that different states will do different things. Okay, so I am over time, okay, but I want to take, if I can just, this I'm going to skip, okay, but I'll just, a 20-second preview in the sense that there's a lot in the India book, but what the India book doesn't do is, because it's written to be so easily readable, it actually hides the intellectual contribution of the book with regard to the discourse and development itself. Okay, so there's a global edition with OUP that will come out end of this year that has a preface that situates this argument in the literatures and state capacity and of development itself. Okay, so I'm going to skip that because that will be more academic. The part that's going to be most relevant to the students. Okay, I wish I had time. I really wish, because there's so many profs here I want to talk about this. But I'll come back, I promise. Okay, and give one more talk on the global thing. The question is, what are we doing about it? Okay, so it would be ironic to write a book and then assume that somehow it'll happen. But the problem is one of weak state capacity. Okay. So what I've also done the last 5 years is set up a nonprofit called CGIS, which is the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States, right? Co-founded by Ashish Dhawan, who's one of the founders of Ashoka University. And the whole idea is it reflects my journey of being at the Planning Commission, being at Niti Aayog, and recognizing that the highest levels of government, the focus is more, you can write reports, but the horizon is too short over which to really do this deep 25-year work. Okay, this is a 25-year agenda of nation building, of institution building. And that requires a kind of entity that can have that long-term horizon by being embedded in government as a trusted long-term partner. Okay, so the way we started was in one state, in Telangana, where the current chief secretary is somebody I've worked with for over 20 years. And so we started in Telangana, we expanded. But the good news in the last year since the book has been out is that the demand has just exploded. Okay, so we've gone from 5 states now to 9. In the last year, we've added Maharashtra, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, and UP, in addition to Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Karnataka, Assam. So basically, and the high-level strategy is a 3x3, right? Where you focus on 3 key horizontals of system strengthening. That's data systems, HR systems, and public finance, right? That's chapter 4, 5, 6. Applied to these 3 critical foundational sectors of education, WCD, and health, okay? Now, the reason I'm doing this is that we are actively recruiting PhDs, okay? And so, and that's why I wanted to make sure I got to this, okay? So there's a modular menu of solutions. So I think in the first 5 years, we were just experimenting, right? So because different states will have appetite for reforms in different areas, you do different projects, you try, you fail, some will succeed, some will learn. And then as you learn, in the past year, we now have a lot more technical partnerships with Government of India ministries, because when I was giving the talk in Gujarat 2 days ago, they were asking, so, can you also come work in Gujarat? I'm like, boss, I don't have the bandwidth right now. But what we're doing is creating some templates that we can then share with the whole bunch of states. So, but one key investment we're making is kind of building an economics and statistics unit for which we are actively hiring. So we hired 4 PhDs last year. Karthik Batra was actually employee number 01. So he joined, spent a year before going on to a faculty member, and both full-time, but also kind of building networks of interested researchers, right? So there are so many researchers who have a lot to contribute, and you're perfectly fine in your faculty jobs, but you have summers, right? Like, it mean that you can come and engage and help with that translation, right? Because there are many well-intentioned bureaucrats who are making decisions, spending tens of thousands of crores, for which like they don't have the time or the bandwidth to go synthesize the evidence and think. There are many academics who have insights that can meaningfully affect that, but have no idea how to build that bridge to policy. Okay, so what we're doing at CGIS is, again, with starting slow, But now that we have these MOUs in the finance departments, a key part of our goal is improving quality of expenditure, right? So like I said, bending that Preston curve. So going forward. So even something as simple as making that second Anganwadi worker. Every 2 pages in the book takes 2 years of actual work, okay? So, but let me give you 2 motivating examples for building the ESU. The first is Amazon, okay? If you look at Amazon as one company has over 1,000 PhDs, 1,000 PhDs. Okay, so 200 economics PhDs, 800 data science operations research PhDs. And what are they doing? They are doing micro optimizing of every aspect of package delivery. Okay, the storage, the supply chain. How do you minimize turnarounds, wastage? And that is probably more than 10 times all central and state government put together in India in terms of how many economists or data scientists we have working on improving the quality of government. Okay, so the rate of return, the public rate of return of bringing that kind of intellectual horsepower to work on these problems is enormous. Okay, so that's, I think, one motivating kind of example. The second motivating example for building the ESU is, if you think, probably India's most important inflection point in 75 years was the 91 reforms, right? Now, 91 reforms did not happen because of the crisis. It happened because there was a whole cohort of policy economists, right? Monte Ahluwalia, Shankaracharya, Bimal Jalan, Arvind Virmani, Shankaracharya, so Dr. Vijay Kelkar, right? So Rakesh Mohan, right? So these are all giants of the 90s and 2000s, that reform generation. But these were people who came in the 80s and came into government and became policy economists. Okay, so and that requires not just the economic reasoning, but it requires the understanding of how government works. It requires the connective tissue of relations within the government. That when there's a policy window to do something sensible, it can mean, are you able to bend it in the right way? Okay, so what we need now is to invest in that kind of human capital, but at the state level, right? And so that just doesn't exist. So the long-term vision of the ESU is to build kind of a cadre of 20, 30 PhDs that kind of have expertise across sectors, have expertise across states, and therefore become kind of this connective tissue between the world of research and the world of practice. Okay, so now the job here is that of a policy economist. Okay, it's a very different job, but it is an important and exciting job. Okay, so sorry for going over, but I hope this was useful, and let me stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that insightful talk. I'm going to call on Professor Rahul Rao, who's our faculty member, to provide you with a token of appreciation.
And I deeply regret. I'm happy to stay for Q&A, but lunch, I'm sure 5 minutes.
So we are quite over time. We're like half an hour behind. So why don't you all ask your question and then make your way towards lunch so that we can try and be back by 2:30. We have Professor Jonathan Colmer's talk scheduled at 2:30. Okay.